So there I was, Captain Riley Morrison, standing in the pristine corridors of the Nexus Research Station, wondering how exactly I'd gotten myself into this particular flavor of stupidity. Oh right, it was the usual combination of professional pride, a generous research grant, and what my late mother would have called an alarming lack of common sense. The invitation had been practically dripping with condescension. "Esteemed Captain Morrison," it began, "because apparently aliens haven't figured out that calling someone esteemed while planning to feed them to a monster is what we humans call mixed signals. The Galactic Xenobiology Council cordially invited me to demonstrate humanity's supposed apex predator status against what they termed a moderately challenging specimen." Moderately challenging. Right. That's like calling a black hole moderately grabby. Dr. Kethvar, the station's lead xenobiologist, had greeted me with all the enthusiasm of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Picture a 7-foot-tall praying mantis wearing a lab coat and an expression that suggested he'd already started writing my obituary. His compound eyes literally gleamed with what I can only describe as scientific schadenfreude. "Captain Morrison," he'd clicked in that way Kethvari do when they're trying not to laugh, "we are so pleased you accepted our invitation. The Council has been most curious about human combat capabilities." Translation: they wanted to watch me get eaten for science. The station itself was impressive, I'll give them that. Gleaming white walls, holographic displays showing various death worlds, and the kind of sterile perfection that screamed we have excellent insurance coverage for researcher casualties. The observation deck overlooked what they called the combat assessment chamber, though I preferred to think of it as the Coliseum for idiots. "Your reputation precedes you," Dr. Kethvar continued, mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. 7 successful predator encounters, 3 species reclassifications, and 1 rather spectacular incident involving a Gornak battle beast that we understand ended with the creature requiring therapy. "Hey, Kevin started it," I protested. "And technically he's doing much better now. Last I heard, he'd taken up landscape painting." The truth was, my success rate had less to do with being a badass and more to do with understanding a simple fact about the universe, every species, no matter how terrifying, as psychology. And psychology, my friends, is just another word for buttons you can push until something breaks. Dr. Kethvar led me to the preparation area, where I could see other researchers gathering in the observation deck above. Chittering, clicking, and what sounded suspiciously like gambling filled the air. Apparently, the betting pools on my survival were quite active, with odds heavily favoring messy death within the first 5 minutes. "The rules are simple," Dr. Kethvar explained, pulling up a holographic display of the combat chamber. "You and the specimen will be sealed in the chamber for a maximum of 40 minutes. The match ends when one party yields, becomes incapacitated. Or," he paused dramatically, "expires." "Charming," I muttered, checking my standard-issue xenobiology gear. No weapons, of course, just sensors, recording equipment, and my seemingly inexhaustible supply of bad attitude. And what exactly am I fighting? Dr. Kethvar's mandibles spread, and what I'd learned was the Kethvari equivalent of a shit-eating grin. A Vorthak Shadow Hunter. "Don't worry," he added with clearly fake reassurance, "we've selected a relatively small one." Relatively small. Because when dealing with interdimensional nightmare fuel, size is definitely the most important factor. "When do we start?" I asked, because apparently my mouth hadn't gotten the memo from my brain about self-preservation. Immediately, Dr. Kethvar replied. "The specimen has been fasting for 3 standard cycles to ensure proper motivation." "Great. Hungry and homicidal. My favorite combination." As they escorted me toward the chamber, I caught sight of the betting board. The over-under on my survival was set at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Honestly, I was a little offended. I'd lasted at least 6 minutes against the Zephyrian acid spitter, and that thing had been actively trying to dissolve me. Time to prove once again that humanity's greatest strength isn't our claws, our teeth, or our physical prowess. It's our absolutely unshakable belief that we can talk our way out of anything, even when that anything has more teeth than a dental convention and an attitude problem to match. The chamber door sealed behind me with a hiss that sounded suspiciously like laughter. The combat chamber was about what you'd expect from a species that considers gladiatorial death matches a legitimate form of scientific inquiry. 30 feet by 30 feet of reinforced durasteel, with walls that could allegedly withstand a direct hit from a plasma cannon. The floor was covered in some kind of grip-enhancing material that I suspected was there less for my safety and more to prevent me from slipping when things got messy. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted nightmare creatures, Dr. Kethvar's voice echoed through the chamber's speakers. We present for your scientific observation the Vorthak Shadow Hunter. A panel in the far wall slid open, and for a moment nothing happened. The chamber remained empty except for me and my growing sense that maybe I should have gone to law school like my father suggested. Then reality decided to take a coffee break. The air in the chamber seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, except this was less oppressive August afternoon, and more malevolent universe having a bad day. The temperature dropped about 15 degrees in 2 seconds, which would have been refreshing if it hadn't been accompanied by a sound that can only be described as what you'd get if you put an industrial blender, a dying cat, and a thunderstorm in a room together and told them to improvise jazz. The Vorthak Shadow Hunter, Dr. Kethvar's voice continued with obvious relish, is indigenous to the shadow dimensions of the Vorthak Nebula. It possesses natural camouflage abilities that render it effectively invisible to most forms of detection. Most forms. I made a mental note of that particular word choice. Its hunting strategy involves psychological warfare, using dimensional phase shifting to create auditory and visual hallucinations in its prey. The specimen you see before you, or rather don't see, has a perfect kill record of 847 encounters across 17 star systems. The invisible death machine let out another sound, this one like someone gargling with broken glass while being electrocuted. Charming dinner conversation, really. Fascinating, I called out loud enough for the observation deck to hear. So what you're telling me is that this thing's entire hunting strategy is based on scaring its prey into making stupid decisions? There was a moment of what I can only describe as offended silence from the creature. Apparently it wasn't used to its prey providing running commentary. Dr. Kethvar's voice crackled through the speakers again. The Shadow Hunter's camouflage is achieved through dimensional frequency modulation. Its claws can phase through most known materials, and its teeth secrete a paralytic toxin that... Yeah, I interrupted, pulling out my sensor array and doing a casual sweep of the chamber. Big, scary, invisible, lots of sharp bits. Got it. Hey, quick question though, if it's so good at this whole predator thing, why does it need to be invisible? I mean, seems like overkill, right? Another sound from the creature, this one distinctly less confident. More like someone gargling with broken glass while having second thoughts about their life choices. The betting displays in the observation deck were updating rapidly. Apparently my survival time had been bumped up to 6 minutes, though I noticed several alien species had started hedging their bets. The creature's invisibility, Dr. Kethvar continued, sounding slightly less gleeful than before, is not merely camouflage but a fundamental aspect of its dimensional nature. It exists partially in our reality and partially in shadow space. Right, I said, walking casually around the chamber while my sensors picked up some very interesting readings. So it's like a cosmic game of peek-a-boo, except with more attempted murder. I have to say, though, for something that's supposedly invisible, it sure is making a lot of noise. The Shadow Hunter's response was immediate and, frankly, a little petulant. The sound it made was like a freight train having an argument with a choir of angry ghosts. I couldn't see the creature directly, but my sensors were painting a very clear picture. Heat signatures, gravitational distortions, electromagnetic fluctuations. The thing was about 8 feet tall, roughly humanoid but with way too many joints in all the wrong places. Its movement patterns were definitely feline, stalking around the perimeter of the chamber in a way that would have been intimidating if I hadn't spent the last 3 years studying predator behavior. Specimen appears to be exhibiting signs of agitation, Dr. Kethvar observed. This is unusual. Typically, shadow hunters remain calm and focused during the initial stalking phase. Maybe it's having an off day, I suggested helpfully. Or maybe it's just not used to prey that actually pays attention. I mean, most creatures probably just run around screaming until they get eaten, right? Where's the sport in that? The betting board was starting to look interesting. My survival odds had improved to almost even money, and I could hear what sounded suspiciously like argument breaking out in the observation deck. The Shadow Hunter made another sound, this one carrying what I could only interpret as wounded professional pride. Here was a creature that had spent its entire evolutionary history being the ultimate boogeyman, and I was treating it like a mildly inconvenient roommate. It's time to see exactly how thin that legendary confidence really was. The match officially began with what Dr. Kethvar announced as commencement of hostile engagement protocols, which is a fancy way of saying now you can try to kill each other legally. The Shadow Hunter wasted no time in demonstrating why it had earned its reputation. 1 second I was standing in an empty chamber. The next I was in the middle of what can only be described as a psychological horror movie directed by someone with serious anger management issues. The walls began to bleed. Not actual blood, of course. This was some kind of dimensional manipulation that made the chamber's surfaces appear to be weeping thick, dark fluid that moved with a life of its own. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees and suddenly the air was filled with whispers and languages that definitely weren't in any translation database. "Oh, very nice," I commented, pulling out my atmospheric scanner. Dimensional phase projection with localized reality distortion. That's some serious evolutionary engineering right there. The whispers got louder and considerably more creative in their descriptions of what they intended to do to my various body parts. Then the Shadow Hunter really got to work. The chamber around me began to shift and change, walls stretching impossibly tall while the ceiling seemed to press down at the same time. The floor became a maze of shadows that moved independently of any light source, and shapes flickered at the edge of my vision, always just out of focus. It was, objectively speaking, absolutely terrifying. It was also complete bullshit. "Impressive," I called out, stumbling dramatically and letting my voice crack just a little. Really top-tier nightmare fuel. I'm particularly fond of the whispers. Very retro horror. Very classic. I made a show of backing against one of the walls, wide-eyed and breathing heavily. Above me, I could hear the alien observers chittering with excitement. The betting pools were going wild, with most money now on me lasting less than 2 minutes. The Shadow Hunter moved closer. I still couldn't see it directly, but my sensors were tracking its position perfectly. It was doing that classic predator thing, taking its time, savoring the fear it thought it was generating. The creature circled me slowly, and I could feel the displacement of air as it passed. Another sound echoed through the chamber, this one like a satisfied purr filtered through a wood chipper. The Shadow Hunter was enjoying itself. "You know," I said, letting my voice shake just the right amount, "I have to ask, do you always go this far overboard with the whole fear thing? I mean, the bleeding walls are nice, but the whispers are a bit much, don't you think?" The creature paused in its stalking. The whispers faltered for just a moment. "It's just that," I continued, still playing the terrified prey while my sensors mapped every inch of the creature's position. Most effective predators rely on efficiency, right? Quick strike, clean kill, minimal energy expenditure. This whole elaborate light show seems like a lot of work for what is, essentially, just lunch. The bleeding walls flickered uncertainly. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's very dramatic, very theatrical. But from an evolutionary standpoint, wouldn't it be more effective to just, bite me and get it over with? The Shadow Hunter let out a sound that was definitely less confident than before, more confused than menacing. Dr. Kethvar's voice crackled through the speakers, sounding increasingly concerned. The specimen appears to be hesitating. This is highly irregular behavior for a Shadow Hunter. Maybe it's having performance anxiety, I suggested helpfully. I mean, with all these people watching, there's a lot of pressure to put on a good show. The creature made another sound, this one almost indignant. I pushed myself off the wall and took a step forward, still maintaining my facade of terror while internally cataloging everything my sensors were telling me about the Shadow Hunter's behavioral patterns. It was fast, definitely faster than me. It was strong, probably strong enough to tear me apart without breaking a sweat. But it was also And this was the important part, completely dependent on psychological intimidation. "You know what I think?" I said, taking another step forward. The Shadow Hunter actually backed up slightly. "I think you've never actually had to fight anything that wasn't already scared to death. Am I right?" The whispers stopped entirely. The bleeding walls faded. And in the sudden silence of the chamber, I could hear something that made me smile. The Shadow Hunter was breathing heavily. It was nervous. The moment I realized the Shadow Hunter was nervous was the moment everything changed. See, there's a fundamental difference between predators and prey, and it's not what most people think. It's not about claws or teeth, or who's bigger. It's about who's more committed to the outcome. And I was about to show this interdimensional horror exactly how committed humans can get. "Oh," I said, straightening up and letting my terrified act drop like a bad habit. "Oh, this is interesting." The Shadow Hunter made a sound like a question mark being strangled. "You've never actually had to work for a kill, have you?" I continued, walking casually around the chamber while my sensors kept tracking the creature's position. 847 encounters, perfect record. But tell me something. How many of those actually fought back? The creature was moving now, trying to circle around behind me, but its movements had lost that confident, predatory flow. There was uncertainty in its posture, hesitation in its steps. "Because here's the thing about humans," I said, spinning around to face exactly where the creature was standing. It froze. "We don't really do the whole rolling over and dying thing. It's not in our nature. We're persistence predators, you see. We don't give up. Ever." I pulled up my sensor display and began reading off numbers. Heart rate elevated but stable. Electromagnetic signatures showing stress patterns. Dimensional phase variance indicating loss of focus. You know what all that means? The Shadow Hunter took a step backward. "It means you're scared." The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The creature's camouflage flickered, and for just a moment I caught a glimpse of what I was dealing with. 8 feet of nightmare-made flesh, with too many joints and way too many teeth, but also with eyes that showed something I recognized. Confusion. Fear. And just a hint of wounded pride. "There you are," I said cheerfully. "Much better. I was getting tired of talking to empty air." The Shadow Hunter's response was to unleash every trick in its psychological warfare arsenal. The chamber filled with illusions, nightmarish visions of death and dismemberment, sounds that scraped against my sanity like nails on a chalkboard, and a presence that pressed against my mind like a weight. It was genuinely terrifying. It was also completely predictable. "Pattern recognition. Amplitude analysis, frequency modulation," I said, reading from my scanner while walking straight through what appeared to be a wall of screaming faces. "You know, for an interdimensional horror, you're actually pretty limited in your approach." The illusions faltered. "Let me guess," I continued, "you phase into our reality, hit the prey with the full nightmare treatment until they're paralyzed with fear. Then move in for the kill while they're too terrified to fight back. Simple, efficient, and completely dependent on your target having a normal fear response." The Shadow Hunter materialized fully, towering over me with claws extended and mouth open, in what was probably supposed to be an intimidating display. Instead, I found myself thinking it looked like an angry cat trying to make itself look bigger. "The problem is," I said, "not backing down an inch. Humans don't have normal fear responses. We have this really annoying habit of getting more dangerous when we're scared. It's called adrenaline, and it's basically nature's way of turning accountants into action heroes." The creature swiped at me with one massive claw, but its heart wasn't in it. The attack was slow, telegraphed, and easily dodged. More importantly, it was desperate. "Oh, and another thing," I added, pulling up another screen on my scanner. "I've been analyzing your dimensional frequency patterns for the last 10 minutes. Want to know what I found?" The Shadow Hunter froze. "You're not actually from a shadow dimension at all, are you? You're from a parallel reality where everything is about 15% more dramatic than it needs to be." The whole shadow thing is just really good marketing. The creature made a sound that I can only describe as the cosmic equivalent of "oh shit." From the observation deck above, I could hear Dr. Kethvar frantically updating his colleagues. Impossible. The specimen should have achieved victory within the first 5 minutes. Human survival beyond this point was not predicted in any of our models. That's because your models assumed I was prey. I called back. Plot twist, I'm not. The Shadow Hunter backed away from me, its posture now completely defensive. The legendary apex predator of 17 star systems was having what humans might call a very bad day. And I was just getting started. Now I want to be clear about something. I wasn't winning this fight because I was stronger or faster or more dangerous than the Shadow Hunter. Physics is physics, and this thing could have torn me apart without breaking whatever it used for sweat. I was winning because I was being absolutely, relentlessly, insufferably human about the whole situation. You know what your problem is? I asked the Shadow Hunter, who was now huddled in the corner of the chamber like a cosmic cat that had been caught knocking things off a table. You've been coasting on your reputation for so long, you've forgotten how to actually hunt. The creature made a sound that might have been a whimper. I mean, look at this whole setup, I continued, gesturing around the chamber. The dramatic entrance, the psychological warfare, the elaborate fear tactics. It's all very impressive, but it's also completely unnecessary if you're actually a competent predator. I walked over to where the Shadow Hunter was crouched and sat down cross-legged about 6 feet away, close enough to be conversational but far enough away to avoid any reflexive swipes. The creature stared at me with what I was beginning to recognize as the interdimensional equivalent of existential dread. See, real predators don't need all the bells and whistles. A tiger doesn't spend 20 minutes setting up mood lighting before it attacks. A shark doesn't give its prey a psychological evaluation before taking a bite. They just get the job done. Above us, the observation deck had gone completely silent. I could practically feel Dr. Kethvar's worldview crumbling in real time. But you, I said, pointing at the Shadow Hunter, you've built your entire hunting strategy around your prey being too scared to think straight. What happens when you run into something that thinks better when it's scared? The Shadow Hunter's response was to curl up into an even smaller ball. And that's not even the worst part, I continued, warming to my theme. The worst part is that you've been so successful with this approach that you've never developed any backup strategies. You're a one-trick pony, except your trick only works on species that haven't figured out that most scary things are actually just really insecure on the inside. I pulled up my communication display and started recording a message. Personal log, Day 1 of the Shadow Hunter encounter. The subject appears to be experiencing what human psychologists would classify as an acute anxiety response. Recommend immediate therapy and possibly a career change. The Shadow Hunter made a sound like a deflating balloon. I'm not trying to be mean, I told it, switching to what my friends back home called my disappointed teacher voice. I'm just pointing out that maybe, just maybe, you've been phoning it in for the last few centuries. When was the last time you actually had to adapt your hunting strategy? When was the last time you learned something new? The creature's electromagnetic signature was showing patterns I'd never seen before in a predator. Shame, self-doubt, and what appeared to be a growing identity crisis. Look, I said, leaning forward slightly, I get it. You've got a reputation to maintain. 847 successful hunts is nothing to sneeze at. But success built on an untested strategy is just luck waiting to run out. The Shadow Hunter lifted its head and looked at me with eyes that held something I'd never expected to see from an apex predator. Confusion. Genuine, heartfelt confusion about where its life had gone wrong. The thing about humans, I explained gently, is that we're really, really good at breaking things that aren't supposed to break. Systems, strategies, legendary reputations, interdimensional horror creatures' self-confidence. We don't mean to do it. Usually. It's just that we have this compulsive need to poke at things until we understand how they work. I gestured at my sensor array. Take this whole encounter, for example. You thought you were hunting me, but actually I was studying you. Every move, every trick, every psychological pressure point. And now I probably know more about how shadow hunters operate than most shadow hunters do. The creature made a sound that was definitely a sigh. So here's what's going to happen, I said, standing up and dusting off my pants. You're going to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, your hunting strategy has some room for improvement. I'm going to write a paper about the psychological vulnerabilities of apex predators. And we're both going to call this a learning experience. The shadow hunter looked up at me with an expression that clearly said, "Can we please just pretend this never happened?" "Sorry," I said. "But the whole galaxy is watching. Time to face the music." What happened next will probably go down in xenobiological history as either the most anticlimactic or most psychologically devastating end to a predator encounter ever recorded. The shadow hunter stood up slowly, looked around the chamber at all the observation equipment and alien faces pressed against the viewing windows, and made a sound that can only be described as the cosmic equivalent of clearing your throat before giving a very awkward speech. It said, and yes, it actually spoke, which apparently was another thing Dr. Kethvar's research team hadn't known about shadow hunters, I concede. The silence in the observation deck was deafening. "I beg your pardon?" Dr. Kethvar's voice crackled through the speakers, sounding like someone who had just watched the laws of physics decide to take a vacation. "I said I concede," the shadow hunter repeated, its voice like gravel being processed through a synthesizer, but definitely understandable. "This human has effectively neutralized my hunting capabilities through psychological analysis and persistent verbal harassment. I am no longer able to function as an apex predator in this encounter." I couldn't help but grin. "Did you just say I won by being annoying?" "Essentially, yes," the shadow hunter replied with what might have been the interdimensional equivalent of a shrug. "Your species appears to have weaponized social awkwardness and turned persistence into a combat strategy. It's deeply uncomfortable." From the observation deck, I could hear what sounded like several different species having very loud arguments in very different languages. The betting pools, I imagined, were in complete chaos. "So," I said, pulling out my recorder again, "for the scientific record, could you explain exactly what happened here from your perspective?" The shadow hunter sat back down, apparently resigned to its fate as the first apex predator in galactic history to lose a fight by having its feelings hurt. "I have spent approximately 4 centuries perfecting fear-based hunting strategies," it began, sounding like a very large, very dangerous therapy patient. "My success rate of 100% was based on the assumption that all prey species would respond to psychological pressure with paralysis and despair." "But," I prompted. "But your species responds to psychological pressure by becoming more aggressive, more analytical, and significantly more talkative. Instead of becoming easier to hunt, you became more dangerous the longer the encounter continued." I made some notes on my recorder. "And how did that make you feel?" "Confused, frustrated, increasingly uncertain about my own abilities." The shadow hunter paused. "I believe humans would call it an existential crisis." Dr. Kethvar's voice cut through the chamber, sounding strained. "This is impossible. Shadow hunters do not experience self-doubt. Shadow hunters do not engage in conversation with prey. Shadow hunters certainly do not concede defeat." "Well," I said cheerfully, "there's a first time for everything. Isn't that right, big guy?" The shadow hunter nodded solemnly. "I believe I may need to reconsider my entire approach to predation. Perhaps therapy, as the human suggested." "I know a guy," I offered. "Kevin the Gornak Battle Beast. He's got a great therapist. Really helped him work through his anger issues." "That would be appreciated," the shadow hunter replied. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how humanity officially broke the galaxy's most feared predator by treating it like a particularly aggressive customer service complaint. Dr. Kethvar eventually managed to get the chamber door open, though he seemed to be having some kind of nervous breakdown of his own. As I walked out, I could hear him frantically updating his research notes. Personal log. Dr. Kethvar. A1 post-encounter. Previous assumptions about human prey behavior require complete revision. Recommend immediate review of all predator-prey classifications involving human subjects. Also recommend significantly higher insurance premiums for any future human research participation. The Shadow Hunter followed me out of the chamber, moving with the dejected posture of someone who had just discovered that their life's work was fundamentally flawed. So I asked it, "What are you going to do now?" "I am considering a career change," it replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps something in customer service. I understand it requires many of the same psychological manipulation skills, but with less risk of encountering humans who fight back with sarcasm." "Solid choice," I agreed. And that's the story of how I accidentally traumatized an interdimensional apex predator by being peak human at it. The research grant was excellent. The scientific papers practically wrote themselves. And I got a new friend who's surprisingly good at relationship advice once you get past all the teeth. As for the moral of the story, well, it's simple. Never underestimate a species that evolved to hunt mammoths by following them around and making annoying noises until they gave up and died of frustration. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, and we're definitely not the most sensible. But we are absolutely, without question, the most irritatingly persistent species in the galaxy. And sometimes that's exactly what you need to win.